So, good morning, everyone. I want to talk this morning about laughter as freedom. Some of you know of the theorist, I guess we'd call him, Alan Watts. He wrote some books. He lived in the 20th century. He died in 1973. He was a Brit. He was actually an ordained Episcopal priest, but he was a student of Eastern philosophy and religion, including but not only Buddhism. And I was actually introduced to his writings in college by my father, who shared with him that same vocation and was pretty open-minded about other spiritual traditions. And he gave me his book. I think it's the one he gave me was The Watercourse Way. And I didn't really resonate with me at the time. I thought it was kind of hard to understand. And it wasn't until years later when I found my way to Buddhism that I revisited him and really resonated, found some of his teachings really impacting my own journey. And I recommend him to you if you don't know him. He's brilliant. He has several books, and he's just a very thoughtful guy. But I wanted today to read a pretty long quote from him from one of his many lectures, and then talk about it. And he says, quote, "The freest people you will ever meet are the ones who can laugh at themselves. You see, when you laugh at yourself, you are no longer imprisoned by the ego. The ego is terribly concerned with keeping up appearances, never wrong, never foolish, always in control. But life, as you know, refuses to be so tidy. We stumble, we blunder, we say the wrong thing. If you can laugh, it means you've discovered something marvelous, that you are not that fragile mask you wear. Humor is a kind of release, a sudden realization that the world doesn't end because you slipped up. It is a gentle reminder that you are more than your image, more than the character you play in the eyes of others. To laugh at yourself is to see through the game, and those who can do it radiate a peculiar kind of lightness. They are not bound by pride, not shackled by the endless need to appear important. They have room to breathe, and in their presence, you feel it too. So laughter, especially at oneself, is not weakness. It is freedom. It is the sound of the ego loosening its grip," close quotes. And we talked a little bit about this on Wednesday in terms of stories, but I wanted to get into this aspect of it because I love that quote, and it's something that's been meaningful in my own practice. And Watts's quote on laughter, self-awareness, and freedom, I think offers really profound insight about loosening the ego's grip on us, our good old friend, the ego. And he suggests that the ability to laugh at oneself reveals a deep freedom, a stepping away from the constraints of pride, of self-image, and the need for control, a stepping away from the constraints of pride, self-image, and the need for control, something we all struggle with. And in our tradition, this laughter represents not only humor and sort of goodwill, but a real spiritual awakening, one that loosens the grip of the ego and opens the door to greater freedom. In Buddhism, the ego, this sense of a fixed, separate self, is often identified, and as we talk about here regularly, as a source of suffering. Because the ego clings to appearances. It clings to the mask we wear. It seeks validation. It wants to be right. It wants to have the last word. It strives for permanence in an impermanent world. We want to carry around this image of ourselves as though it was permanent. And Watts describes how the ego, and this is another quote, is terribly concerned with keeping up appearances. Never wrong, never foolish, always in control, as I said earlier, close quotes. This mirrors the Buddhist teachings of how the ego causes unnecessary tension, stress, and suffering by attempting to maintain an illusion of stability in a world that is inherently unstable. The ego, in its constant effort to preserve this fragile self-image, can lead to fear, frustration, and dissatisfaction. And it is exhausting trying to manage it. It is exhausting trying to keep it up. For instance, when we stumble or make a stupid mistake, something we all do more than we care to admit, the ego often reacts with shame or defensiveness, fearing judgment from others. Watts, however, reframes these moments as opportunities for freedom. Because if we laugh at ourselves in those moments, in a sort of, mock our self-importance, we loosen the ego's grip, and we recognize by that our mistakes do not define us. They only show our humanity. They make us more human. Now, as hard as this has been for me in my practice, especially early on, I can't tell you how freeing has been. We talked about social anxiety on Wednesday. I'm no longer as anxious in social situations or when I give talks, because if I screw up, it's just not a big deal, whereas it used to be catastrophic. I would just die inside. This aligns with our practice of seeing through the illusion of self and embracing the impermanence of all things, including our image of who we think we are. This image we hold on to, the image of who we think we are. So this laughter, this ability to sort of see the humor in our mistakes, helps us cultivate a freedom from all that. And this is, I tell you, been one of the best gifts of this practice in my own life. I laugh at myself when I mock my sense of self-importance, and what a change that's been from trying to maintain that sense of self-importance. It's become sort of a standard joke in my family, where I can sort of make fun of myself. It is the letting go of this clinging, not only to material possessions, but to ideas, to identities, and especially to this false image and the pride that accompanies it, the pride that accompanies self-importance. Watts beautifully illustrates this principle through the act of being able to laugh at oneself. And I don't mean in a mean, judgy way. I mean in a light way. When we laugh at our own missteps, we let go of the need to be perfect, which we talked about a couple weeks ago, and we let go of the need to be in control. This laughter, as Watts put it in the quote, is, quote, a kind of release, a sudden realization that the world does not end because we've slipped up. Now, this release is not a trivial act. It is not a trivial act. It is a moment of profound spiritual insight. As frivolous as it might be, it is a moment of profound spiritual insight. In those moments, we see that our self-image is not as self-important, is not as solid as we believed. We step back from identifying with the fragile mask of the ego, the fragile self-image. And there's a lightness that comes from being unburdened by this preoccupation with pride. Those of us that were raised in the Christian tradition remember that the quote is, pride goeth before the fall. Pride goeth before the fall. I grew up hearing that in Sunday school, meaning that excessive pride or arrogance often leads to one's downfall or failure. You can't maintain it. Sooner or later, we're going to trip up or something's going to happen and the fall is going to happen. That quote serves as a warning to remain humble, to remain cautious, because overestimating ourselves often ends with negative consequences. Overestimating our sense of self-importance often ends with negative consequences. None the least of which is the suffering that comes from being exposed as not the self we try to portray. The humiliation that comes, and the suffering that comes in the form of humiliation from being exposed as not that self-important self that we try to portray. The lightness from learning to laugh at ourselves is a glimpse into freedom. It is a taste of freedom from the attachments to a self-image that bind us. We are freer from the attachments to that self-image which locks us in a box. Laughter at oneself can be seen as a form of mindfulness in action. When we laugh at our mistakes, rather than expending all this energy trying to hide them or excuse them or deflect them. We are fully present with our humanity, warts and all. We are not consumed by the regret about the past or the fear of how others might perceive us. You know how that thing where you go to a social event and we come home and we just debrief it. We're, oh, I should have done that. I should have done this. I should have done the other. That's where we need to laugh at ourselves rather than beat ourselves up for all our perceived social miscues. We accept the moment as it is when we think we've done stupidly. With all its imperfections, we respond with kindness and we respond with humor. Watts's description of what he calls the peculiar kind of lightness radiated by those who can laugh at themselves. This also aligns with the practice of equanimity, because we are not shackled by the endless need to appear important, as Watts says. We are not shackled by the endless need to appear important. We embody a spaciousness of mind and heart. We are free from the need to control constantly how we want others to see us. And boy, is there freedom in that. It creates a sense of ease, not only in ourselves, but those around us. It's contagious. We're kind of light. We're kind of laughing. We're kind of, mocking ourselves in a loving way. I mean, it just puts everybody at ease. I was recently in a situation, a group situation, with someone who I know who was clearly socially anxious. I mean, they were just kind of shaking with anxiety. They were hypervigilant, scanning the group for any perceived disapproval or negative judgment, very self-conscious, very self-aware about they were so stiff, their speech was stilted. It was just painful to watch, partly because I've been there. They could not relax or enjoy themselves. They were totally preoccupied. And I felt so bad for them because they were clearly suffering something, as I said, I know all too well from my past. And I knew that when they got home, they would be harshly judging themselves for the next 24 hours about how they were in that group. That kind of thing feeds on itself. The more we feel it, the more uptight we get, the more we act in a way that we know is going to send off that appearance of discomfort. Now, I think for this person, the whole process was largely unconscious, at least when they were there, which is where much of our suffering lives. It doesn't live in our conscious awareness. That's why we talk about mindfulness all the time. The vulnerability that we talked about back in October is one avenue out of this form of suffering. Laughing at oneself requires a certain amount of vulnerability. If we're not willing to be vulnerable, I don't think we're able to laugh at ourselves. Watts's observation, quote, to laugh at oneself is to see through the game of specialness of self-importance. It resonates deeply with seeing through these illusions of a false self, of the ego. Life, as the Buddha taught it, is like a play or a dream, a fleeting series of experiences that we often take way too seriously. But the ego clings to this script, it clings to this play, trying to control the narrative and protect its role within it. But when we laugh at ourselves, we acknowledge the vulnerability and the imperfection inherent in being human. Every one of us carries that. But when we laugh at ourselves, it is an expression that we are acknowledging the vulnerability and imperfection inherent in being human. This humility is not a weakness. It is a strength. It requires courage to do it. It takes tremendous courage to be vulnerable, as we talked about in October. But it is a recognition that our shared humanity and interconnectedness with others is always there. When we stop taking ourselves too seriously, we become not only more accepting of our own flaws, but by extension, the flaws of others, which creates a genuine space for connection and kindness. It's part of what joins us. Qualities that arise naturally when we no longer feel the need to defend or uphold the ego's image of perfection, which we also talked about recently. Ultimately, Watts's insight that, quote, laughter, especially at oneself, is not a weakness, it is a strength. Freedom is not about controlling external circumstances, the stuff outside of us. It's about liberating the mind from the chains of ego, attachment, and delusion. All that's going on inside. When we laugh at ourselves, we take a step away from that toward freedom. We recognize that we are not the character we play or we think we play in the eyes of others. But nor are we defined by our mistakes. They're just part of the deal. We are far greater than that. They make up the totality of us, something that cannot be reduced to appearances or confined by pride. In this way, humor and laughter, and again, let me say, not mean-spirited humor, just to be clear, becomes a spiritual practice, a reminder that life doesn't have to be so heavy all the time. It is a way of embracing the impermanence and the unpredictability of existence with both grace and joy. As Watts so eloquently puts it, and I love this quote, laughter is, quote, the sound of the ego loosening its grip. The sound of the ego loosening its grip. That would be, if you want a takeaway phrase for today, that would be it. From a Buddhist perspective, this loosening is the beginning of freedom. A freedom that allows us to live with lightness, with authenticity, and with compassion. So those are some thoughts this morning on laughter at ourselves as a practice.